Morning, everyone. So pleased you could be with us for Groundwork, the opening session, one of the two opening sessions of 6 Degrees Calgary. Format is simple, speed, speaking and then dating maybe. We have 4 people who are going to talk to you for 6 to 7 minutes each about their work in communities at the ground level. And then we're going to immediately constitute a conversation on stage, which will quickly involve all of you using our microphones, including our spongy throw-around microphone. We have about 75 minutes, and it will be a failure, this event, if by halfway through it's not a very big conversation. This is the only time we don't use the in the round. We're using a traditional theater, but that should not and will not stop us from having a chat. Don't forget a final reminder to submit your comments and questions on www.slido.com with the event code #6degreesYYC. We'll be compiling your ideas to inform how the day unfolds. That's literally how active we want this to be. If you're trending as a group, we want to know about it, and then we try and incorporate what you want us to be talking about as the day goes on. Our first speaker, please welcome Dr. Aleem Bharwani, Director of Public Policy and Strategic Partnerships at the Cumming School of Medicine and the lead for the public policy at the O'Brien Institute for the Public Health at the University of Calgary. Aleem is recognized for his leadership by 2 international societies, the American College of Physicians and the Society of General Internal Medicine. Aleem.
I wasn't sure if I passed out for a second. Yeah, I've already dropped the mic. Welcome to med school. Today's lesson is you can be a doctor without going to medical school if you're active in your community. I'd like you to meet Judith. Judith is a 63-year-old lady who presents to your emergency room with 2 hours of crushing retrosternal chest pain on the left side of her chest, radiating to her neck, her back, and her jaw. So what do you think is the most likely diagnosis by show of hands? A, heart attack. B, stroke. C, peripheral vascular disease. Good, so she's most likely having a heart attack. But what is a heart attack? A heart attack is when you have near or total obstruction of a blood vessel, resulting in the impediment of oxygen from flowing through the vessel to the organ, causing tissue in that organ to die. If it happens in the heart, it's a heart attack. If it happens in the brain, it's a stroke. And if it happens in one of your extremities, it's peripheral vascular disease. But what damages these vessels to begin with? Consequences of a sedentary lifestyle, poor diet, smoking, but these account for maybe only half of the risk of heart disease. What about the rest? So let's dig to root cause. In medicine, that means thinking of the embryo. The heart and its vessels form very early in life. 2 weeks after conception, the heart is already starting to form. And by 8 weeks, the heart is formed. So how does the heart health of the fetus influence adult heart health? Data from famines and pandemic flus show babies born during such times of stress have a higher risk of adult onset vascular disease, diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. You see, the fetus thinks it's entering into a tough environment, so it goes into a thrifty mode to store nutrition, to save calories for what it expects will be a scarce or rocky road ahead. That means long after you're a fetus, as an adult, you're still feeling the effects from when you were a fetus. Our patient Judith doesn't control her genes, famines, or pandemic flus, yet they all impact her chronic disease risk as an adult. Even after birth, as a child, if she's subject to physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, malnutrition, the child becomes stressed. Adrenaline and cortisol levels rise. Toxic stress then carries through to adulthood. Different genes seem to get turned on, and as these stress hormones rise, so do rates of high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, leading to heart disease. Yeah. Our childhood experiences, our nutrition, our physical safety, our emotional connection, all impact our heart disease risks as adults. So let's take a step back. What is under our patient's control and what is not? What a patient is fed, how that patient is treated as a small child, the stress a patient is exposed to as a fetus, our patients have no control over. Yet those factors influence the patient's vascular health throughout her adult life, to such an extent that they even modulate the impact of our lifestyle choices. Because if your body is becoming thrifty, each burger and each hour on the sofa counts a bit more against you, and each step counts a bit less for you. In 2013, we rallied because we recognized natural disasters strike more by luck than by choice. In 2013, if you picked up a pail, if you cleaned a house, if you gave food or shelter, or if you donated, you know what it means to help people who suffer from conditions they didn't create. So you understand what it means to be a citizen, which means you intuitively understand inclusive public health. Likewise, adults today at risk for heart disease, stroke, or vascular disease aren't in full control. They can't control their childhood. For them, a calorie doesn't equal a calorie and a step doesn't equal a step. So while I advocate compassion individually, I emphasize hope collectively. Many of these non-modifiable risk factors are in fact modifiable, just not by the individual, but by the community. I can't go back in time to change Judith's fetal or early childhood experience, but we can change our fetal lives and our childhoods as a community, because compassion is protective. If you are a big brother or big sister to a child, if you help your new neighbor adjust to Canada, if you smile at the kid on the stroller on the bus, or if you donate time or money to the women's shelter or YMCA, or if you're supporting the arts for kids, you're helping improve the heart health of Canadians 50 years into tomorrow. You're making the kids and moms' lives better today, and we're reducing health costs for the next generation. Committing to the well-being of others is an act of citizenship. So while you may not wear a semi-pretentious white coat, you are all doctors by being active in your communities, by preventing disease this generation and next.
Thank you, Aleem. Next up, we have Carrie Yap presenting We Don't Use the Dishwasher for That. Carrie is a community advocate and urban planner for the Federation of Calgary Communities. She has a particular interest in tactical urbanism and its implementation, designing art projects around the city. Carrie, please.
Don't have to be close to this one, okay? That's adjusted. Not to this one. Okay? Yeah.
A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to participate in a unit review. After we said our greetings, one of them said, "Well, Carrie and the old men are here, so let's get started." I am an urban planner with the Federation of Calgary Communities. We are a not-for-profit that advocates for community needs. And I have the opportunity to sit at the table when major decisions are made and when policies, projects, and plans are discussed. But often, I am the only female, minority, or millennial. In my journey through this profession, I've begun to question whether my experience of Canada was being reflected in these policies, plans, and projects. And based on my experience, I questioned, who are we building these communities for? Are these communities reflecting my experience? And in general, are we behind in the way we plan our cities and our communities? Planning, by definition, is the development and use of land. Our current state of building new communities is that we build for those that make above $65,000, because amenity spaces come at a cost. Tennis courts, gyms are not free to the public, but exclusive to the users of the community. We build houses for nuclear families with large backyards. But this is a built environment for the Canadian without a hyphen, and I am a Canadian with a hyphen. While many of you were eating hot dogs and s'mores, I was roasting yams and chicken wings. While many of you may have had your own bedroom, I had a bunk bed because I lived in a multi-generational household. Tennis, baseball, shuffleboard, I've never played any of these. Rather, I played Chinese chess and field hockey. And while many of you used your dishwasher for washing your dishes, We didn't use our dishwasher for that. We used it for storage. So if my perception of how I used space in my community was different, then who are we building our communities for? Often, the decisions are made by those opposite to me, whose experiences do not reflect my experiences. Like the dishwasher, the community that I grew up in was something that I and others had to adapt to. They were not made for Canadians with a hyphen at the forefront. To be clear, this is not an us versus them conversation. Rather, it's an exploration of whether the Canadian dream is outdated and what is planning's role in updating its definition. In 2011, 33.7% of Calgary's population was a visible minority. In 2020, we project another 500,000 immigrants to come to Calgary. Are we building for what we know or for what they need? Are we planning for ethnic diversity? And who is sitting at the table? With the recent influx of immigrants from Syria, the Philippines, China, Nigeria, our workforce has become diversified. My colleagues, Canadians with a hyphen, are qualified and diversified, and they're helping me to make these plans. But they're not sitting at the table and making those major decisions or holding those leadership positions. Has diversity become a side project? In 2036, 1 in 2 people in Calgary will be an immigrant or child of an immigrant. We are currently not building our experiences together, but 2 experiences with 2 lenses. We continue to use a monochromatic template when Calgary has become polychromatic. Inclusion is always a side project, a value statement, or an afterthought. An example is where our cultural institutions are found in the industrial areas versus being in the center of our communities. And where we have seen small successes like integrating cricket pitches rather than baseball diamonds, these are surface level solutions that do not address inclusion and diversity. If 1 in 2 of us will be an immigrant or child of an immigrant, are we taking the time to learn about our Canadian hyphens and their needs? According to Plan H, which are policies developed by the BC Healthy Community Society to plan healthier communities, we need to integrate social connectedness, history, and culture into our land use planning projects. This means that when we're talking about topography, zoning, road structures, we also need to be thinking about who will be living in Calgary. We need to embrace diversity and find commonality. In 2036, 40% of the working age population will belong to a visible minority group. We all have different expectations of what is community. In planning, we believe that the theory is that we all integrate with proximity, but the reality is we find commonality in our likeliness. People act and do based off what they know. Cultural groups find their sense of belonging by grouping together and creating Chinatowns, Greek towns, or Italian towns. But they're often criticized for being enclaves. But they're examples of diversity in our city, built out of necessity to adapt to the Canadian environment, and are around because of their resiliency. Ironically, while they are now celebrated and a symbol of diversity, they were born out of segregation. Where we can find commonality, Canadian hyphen or not, is that we all have a need for shared spaces. We just start nurturing our community and find commonality through shared public spaces. So designing public spaces that prioritize human interaction and social connections, designing local and regional parks to include food amenities such as picnic tables, shelters, and water access that allow people to eat together in a shared environment. We have this example in Bowness Park in Calgary, where in that one regional park you see people eating a variety of cultural cuisines. So how are we tackling this? Well, at the Federation of Calgary Communities, we believe that to create a welcoming space, you have to be deliberate. It requires intention to help residents feel welcome and included. It's deliberate, but not difficult. And we are doing 3 things. For one thing, planning at the Federation is no longer a separate profession or siloed. It is integrated into our engagement team, where we work closely with our colleagues who specialize in governance, communication, community development, and engagement. We've developed the planning cue cards, which summarize the planning process in Calgary in 8 cue cards. And they have now been translated into 11 languages, including Farsi, Korean, or Spanish. And we believe in the idea of community hubs, which is to combine our resources and ideas and people in a central space that is accessible, breaks down barriers, and increases abilities for people to connect. They are common spaces for everyone. So to conclude, I quote Councillor Jody Gondek, who recently criticized the lack of diversity on the board for the Calgary Economic Development by saying, "We've got to stop making diversity a value statement and start actually practicing it."
Thank you, Carrie. Please join me in welcoming Colin Menzies to the stage from Art to talk about Art Builds. Colin is an interdisciplinary artist and the manager of Studio C, an art center that creates inclusive culture through collaborative projects, art projects, classes, and gallery exhibitions. You can find his music, videos, short films, and animated series under his alias, Subliminal Rabbit. Colin, please.
Hello. I just need a moment to capture this beauty. Thank you. My name's Colin, and I'm here to speak about Studio C, a collaborative arts center here in Calgary. We are based in the C-Space King Edward building in Marda Loop, a new project that just started up that revamped a heritage building into a modern art facility. So Studio C has been going since 2005. How do we create inclusive culture in Calgary? We do it through public art exhibitions, we do it through classes, through skill building programs, through artist residencies, through city mural collaborations, volunteer initiatives, quite a variety of ways that we engage different communities. So who are the communities that we work with? We work within mental health sector, disability, newcomers to Canada, LGBTQ youth, seniors, children, and all of those groups, or each of those groups, connect to Studio C as an entry point into the arts community, but more importantly, as a platform for empowerment. So one example that I would share, just to give you context in terms of the work that we do, is an individual named Logan. So Logan came to Studio C kind of in a place of hopelessness, very failed from his own perspective of the education system and his employment experience. So he came into a program of ours called Art Recruits, which is a first of its kind in Canada, in that it's a mental health program that uses art as a means of teaching employment skills. So to date, the program has placed 86% of our participants in employment. So Logan was at a time in his life where he was dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety, and was looking for work. So he alongside his these are just random photos of Studio C just to give you some animated examples. Logan, alongside his participants, participated in a series of workshops, each identifying a transferable essential skill. So they learned time management, problem solving, conflict resolution, how to set goals, how to work within a team. And those workshops were taught through photography, painting, drawing, sculpture. And then Logan and his group identified a company that they would like to collaborate with. So they reached out to WestJet. WestJet sent their staff over to Studio C, and our participants then led an art collaboration project for the staff of WestJet as a team building for them. So that's where he put some of those transferable skills into action. Then the participants plan a public art exhibition. They plan everything from curating the artwork to what musicians are going to be brought in, down to the refreshments, to the pricing of the work, and then marketing the show. So the last step of the program is placement. And so Logan was placed in a job which he has now flourished in the human services sector here in Calgary. He started a family. He's at a point now where he comes back to our space and offers workshops to empower people that are going through what he was going through years ago. And by no means is it a happily ever after, but it's a story of that resiliency, is when you're giving people the tools to empower them and the resources and the confidence. The potential that can be reached is inspiring, and where Logan is today is a result of that community building, of inclusion, not just as a buzzword, but as a means of everybody having a seat at the table. And so I encourage any of you, if you're interested in collaborating and connecting, we love exploring the opportunities. And I think, again, bringing it back to a platform for resiliency, how important that is something that we want to continue growing within this country. So thanks for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Colin. And last, Jeremy Klaszus, presenting the journalism we need. Jeremy is the founder and editor of the Sprawl, which came into being in 2017 as a way to keep local journalism alive in tough times through pop-up journalism. He's a freelance writer, communications consultant, and correspondent for Monocle. Jeremy was awarded a Gold Quill Award from the International Association of Business Communications for crisis communications following his coverage of the South Alberta floods of 2013. Please welcome Jeremy Klaszus.
Sure. So I got to say, the pressure is on to be up on this stage. Usually I come here with my kids and they're shooting flames right across the stage. So I have no pyrotechnics, but this will hopefully go well. So I'm a journalist, and I've worked as a journalist for over 15 years. And I want to talk quickly to you about how we don't need more words. We don't need more words in our society. And this is a paradox I've come to embrace, because as a journalist, it's my job to fill space. There's always a column that needs written. There's a newscast that needs filling. But I want to read to you something from Henry Nouwen, the Dutch theologian Henry Nouwen. And this is written in 1981. So this is pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook. He says, "The main function of the word, which is communication, is no longer realized. The word no longer communicates, no longer fosters communion, no longer creates community, and therefore no longer gives life. The word no longer offers trustworthy ground on which people can meet each other and build society." And so when we look around the world today, you don't have to look far to see this. Look south of the border. Look to what's happening in provincial politics in Ontario. Look at what's about to happen in Alberta and is already happening and will intensify over the next year. Words are thrown out and misused, and in this torrent of information, the most strident voices hold sway. And so I've come to this and realized, you know what? My primary task as a journalist is not to put more words into the world. My primary task as a journalist is actually to enter into silence and somehow invite my readers to be there as well. And so I call my local riff on this pop-up journalism. And the idea is I cover certain things for certain amounts of time rather than trying to cover everything all the time. And I say it's a made in Calgary solution, but the reality is it's a riff on a global trend toward what's sometimes called slow journalism, or I like to call it quiet journalism. So we're outside the daily news grind. We aim to bring context instead of clickbait. And this is an urgent task in this world. We are told that we need to be always on, always plugged in, and that this is being informed and that this is engagement with our society. But I want to suggest that that's an illusion. Earlier this year, there was a Danish TV station that did an experiment of sorts. They said, okay, we're going to leave Facebook for 2 weeks. So any publisher in this day and age right now uses Facebook a lot. We think we need Facebook. You think you need to be on Facebook. But they said, we're leaving for 2 weeks. And they expected all their traffic to collapse and for it to be bad, basically. So what happened at the end of 2 weeks? They said it was like a spa vacation. They found that their traffic actually was pretty steady. It didn't plunge as far as they thought. And they found that it rejuvenated their editorial perspective. They were more creative, and they could do more without being without having their head in the digital churn. And so this is why I say we need to enter silence, because when you enter silence, you begin to see. You can listen and regain perspective. And I want to go back to Henry Nouwen, because this is what he says about silence. And silence gets a bad rap in our world. We're told we always need to be in reaction to something. And when we do that, the powers of chaos can manipulate us. Like, journalists are too easily gamed by all this early morning tweeting, oh, we need to cover this and you need to react to it. We don't. This is what Henry Nouwen says. Silence is the home of the word. Silence gives strength and fruitfulness to the word. We can even say that words are meant to disclose the mystery of the silence from which they come. So it's in this place, from silence, that we can bring something back to a noisy, polarized world. Because if we can't disrupt this digital churn, just noise upon noise, we're going to close up. And we see that everywhere. Our society will close up. And we won't have a place of encounter. Where can we truly encounter each other? It begins in silence. So I hold these two things in tension. And at times I panic because in this thing I've built the sprawl. Silence is built into the design. I say I'm going to cover something deeply and then I'm going to be quiet. And when I'm quiet, I panic, inevitably. I think this is terrible. People are not going to support me anymore. People are not engaged. I need to, even now, right, as I speak with you, there's a meeting at City Council about the Olympic bid. I feel I should be there. I shouldn't be here with you, but I should be here with you in this quiet space where we can encounter each other. And so, yeah, I panic, and then I'm reminded, you know what? People tell me they're happy to not have that fire hose of information turned on them. People are weary of a torrent of information. And when you bring to them something that comes from silence, they're relieved. So it's a mutual trust. And yeah, it's a kind of a weird thing that I'm still wrapping my head around. But I'll leave you with this. In a world of noise, it's silence that will save us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, we need 90 seconds to set up our chairs. Let me throw out a few things that I heard that I think maybe we want as a group to discuss. Jeremy just said that we don't need more words. He used words to say that, and he read from an esteemed author expressing the idea. Colin said that art empowers employment skills. How about that? Carrie said that the Canadian dream is outdated and that we're building communities for people who make over $65,000 a year. Aleem said that communities stop diseases. I think that's a very startling thing to say, and he has drawings to prove it. I'd like our four guests to please rejoin me on the stage for a conversation. Aleem, on the left, Carrie, Colin. We're going to get a couple more microphones. We have, I am very pleased to say, and I appreciate the concise presentations, we have about 35 minutes, which gives us time to talk a little amongst ourselves, if only so that you can ask each other questions about what you said, because that's something I notice at things like this, is that people often don't get a chance to ask each other things that arose. And then, of course, to open it up. You see our spongy yellow micro, Karen's holding it up. It travels. It doesn't hurt if it comes at you a little frontally.
Shall we give it a go?
Yeah, sure. Throw
So
it.
what you do is, if you have something to say, I'm going to throw it to someone in the more or less front row. Oh, I see a hand up. I'll come as close as I can. Once you get it, you just speak right into it like this. So it has to be fairly close and hold it right up. But it travels and theoretically doesn't break.
Yes.
And the other thing I wanted to mention, if you are using one of these mics, this goes for our speakers as well, up close but underneath, so that you don't get this.
Yeah.
So underneath your chin, but quite close. Here we go. Let's just give this catch box a go. Who had said? 1, 2, 3.
Hello.
All right, very nice. That is Anila Yuan's brother.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
Okay,
you. Thank
Okay.
you for having me.
the catch box is operational. I'm going to start by asking our 4 speakers if they'd like to ask each other anything.
Thanks. Carrie, I was intrigued by what you were saying about like the Canadian dream. And I think we're just moving further in that evolution of ideas where certain practices are getting dated and it's time to break through and move forward and freshen things up. I love that about what you're saying. And I'm wondering, are there any projects that you have done that you could speak to that you feel touch on that?
Like physical planning projects, or I guess like how we've been implementing some of those ideas. I think for one thing, I kind of touched point on that, but the planning cue cards. So we originally made those with the idea that the planning process in Calgary is so complicated. And we expect Calgarians to just engage with it without any background. And so we summarized a document we have called the Community Guide to the Planning Process in 8 simple cards. And so what we recently did is that we translated them into 11 languages because not everyone in Calgary that wants to engage in the planning process speaks English. And so we translated them into 11 languages, and they're currently being vetted. But it's the idea that we see this most recently with the secondary suites conversation, where a gentleman came up and he wanted to speak, but he couldn't convey his point because he couldn't speak English. And so George Hall had to translate for him. And this is the idea that in planning, the profession is supposed to be about making communities for everyone, but we kind of keep it to those that can understand the lingo or the jargon that we call it, and have a degree or background in it, even though really we're supposed to be building for everyone. And so there's that irony that we're not fully accessible, even though we're supposed to be.
Anybody else?
Kind of tied into that, Aleem, I'm curious. Your talk kind of showed us that health is beyond what we think of as health. But I find, even for myself, as a journalist, we tend to think of health as hospitals or like it's a very clear bucket. How do you think we can kind of navigate that paradigm shift to see what you're talking about in everyday life, I guess?
Excellent question. I think it's about trust. So I think our healthcare providers, our healthcare institutions need to be embedded, engaged in community. And the more we can build relationships with different civil society stakeholders, with different corporate stakeholders, different individuals, I think the more we can build trust and help each other understand what we can do better to empower community and what community can do better to empower itself. And I think that ongoing dialogue will move us all forward.
Sounds like journalism in some ways.
I have a bit of a question. It's more of a dialogue based off what you're saying, because often in planning, healthy communities is such a buzzword. We want to build healthy communities where we tackle social isolation and obesity and all that stuff. But when it really comes down to it, the policies that we make are so high level. They're create green spaces, make it more walkable. But when it comes to those policies and plans, that never actually translates. And so by the time that we want to create these healthy communities, we still have car-oriented communities that come first. We still have very small green spaces where people can interact. And so I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on this.
So public policy and community organizing need to find their commonality. And so I think you need people, positions, orientations within these different organizations that connect the macro level policy to the work on the ground. And I think it comes back to trust, relationships, and building relationships at the level of communities. Because as we do that, I think then we can start connecting those. What influences a policy, in my view, is not only the data or the will of certain individuals, but it's also how vocal and how pervasive that opinion and will is among those communities. So the more we can encourage understanding and then translate that into active, vocal members, then policy will start to form, because government is representation of us. So sometimes it's easy for us to say, well, government needs to do this, they need to do that, but they are we, like that is us. And so I think we just need to be better at empowering, enabling voice. Does that?
It does.
Yeah. And I want to throw it back to you. So yeah, a lot of what we're talking about is founded in principles of journalism. What do you think we could do better as a med school? What do you think you could offer that we're not drawing on from you in order to move this common objective forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for me, it's always challenging because I don't think to call, if I'm doing a story on, I don't know, like you're talking about car dependency, I don't think to call a health professional to get that insight into it necessarily. So I think it's maybe a mutual, trying to broaden that out a bit so that, yeah, health professionals are brought into those conversations a little bit more, not just when something goes wrong and somebody is struck, a pedestrian is struck on the road. Then we consider that a medical issue, right? But yeah, it's a good question. I don't fully know the answer, but.
I'd like to actually ask Colin and maybe Jeremy a question that's emerged from something Aleem said. And correct me if I had this wrong. Did you say that compassion is protective?
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you, Colin? Compassion is protective. And maybe, actually anybody. I think it's a lovely idea. So please go ahead. I'd like to hear from everybody actually on that one. And then we'll open it up. Go on, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I feel like that's one to sit with. Compassion is protective. I don't know. See, now I'm in this paradox. I just talked about how we don't need more words, and now I got to say more words. Can you improve upon that?
Can I add to that?
protective. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone here has seen that show, What Would You Do? This to me is an example of being protective. They basically set up social scenarios, actors, that do something like laugh at somebody with a disability or tell a child who has Tourette's to be quiet and sit down at a restaurant. And then they plant public in that situation to see how they would respond. To me, compassion is protective. If you don't stand up, if you don't say anything, then that compassion is not being exercised. And that, we're talking about inclusion. I would want to be somewhere where somebody does have compassion toward me to stand up and say something. That to me would be exemplary of that statement.
I guess when you were saying that, I was kind of thinking about when we're creating those plans, those community plans, and it's often for the able-bodied, those that can walk without any issues, those that don't have any income issues. It's often, it's often that. But the reality is that, for example, sidewalks are only one side of the street. We don't always have ramps everywhere. We don't have, our sidewalks aren't for the visually impaired. Our green spaces are only for those that can, that I guess have the privilege to use them because they come at a cost now. We're no longer prioritizing public spaces, community spaces, as what should be the centers of our community. Rather, we're putting in what people can afford and the luxury items when that actually isn't very accessible at all. And I kind of give an example of this. I saw this new community plan, and the concept was great. It was all about food agriculture and how we'll all be, and all the green spaces we have, we'll be planting food and we can all eat from them. And there'll be a cannery there, and we'll process food and everyone will share it. But the reality is, when it comes to that, because you as a resident who's living in that community has to pay for all those amenities, I couldn't actually even afford to live there. Even with my partner, we couldn't afford to live there because the amenities to have a cannery, to put water under all the ground, to have sewage and all stuff, increases the cost of that community and actually makes that community, which is supposed to be inclusive, exclusive.
Does anybody? Let's open this up. Anybody want to say a thought on what Aleem meant by compassion is protective? Anybody want to jump in on that before I ask Aleem to elaborate? Yes, at the back.
Hi there. I really resonated with that point. I work with transgender youth, and one of the main barriers trans youth face is acceptance from their parents and their family. And we know that with rejection comes a lot of negative health outcomes like addiction, higher risk for poor mental health, risk of suicide later in life. So when you said that, I was just thinking of like the protective factors I discuss with parents all the time and how their compassion really does lead to way better mental health outcomes and physical health outcomes for trans youth.
Anyone else before Aleem? Yes, ma'am. Steph, the middle there, you got her, great.
Thanks to everyone for the wonderful talks. Aleem, I love the way that you presented your medical school, and I think the compassion is protective is very important as we think about the broad spectrum of determinants of health, one of which is health services. As you've been talking, Carrie, about the urban planning, it strikes me that one of the things that we need to remember as part of being compassionate, understanding the other, is that some people, due to their economic circumstances, wouldn't even have time to use those green spaces. So we need to look at economic circumstances, availability of free time, the social and physical environments as part of our planning. Thanks.
Aleem, well, there's somebody, but why don't you elaborate a little bit more and get this going, and then we'll come back.
I think everyone is naturally has some degree of obviously compassion, and so I think in terms of what's actionable, in my view, whatever you have in excess is what's easiest to give, and so that often then reflects something you're good at, something you have more of. Whatever you have excess of, I think let that flow downstream. And so if you have more time, if you have more money, if you have knowledge or skill in a particular area, by letting that flow outward towards someone who needs it, I think that is, how we can manifest the protective nature of compassion. And it makes it a little bit easier because it doesn't feel like, oh man, like I have enough to do, like I already have a full day and I've got this and this and this, all these other things to do. But it's much easier to give of something that you feel you have in excess or you know better. And I think that's just the way I've been thinking about it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This question is really for all the speakers. So to the point about compassion being protective, I think trying to understand that phrase within our social context, which is kind of what was discussed, we are very plugged in, and a lot of our time is taken up by social media. There was a term that was going around, and I can't recall it, but this concept of how we see advocacy and compassion and caring for people by liking posts that have these, really emotive stories or sharing about different struggles around the world. Or we share those posts, and now we pat ourselves on the back for having done something by sharing a positive message. How do we go about pulling people back into reality, into community? So the show was brought up, right, where you create these social experiments and you have people kind of being tested to see how they'll respond in real world situations. But when we spend so much time online and say, okay, well, I shared this post, I like this post, I'm following these things, and I'm trying to educate myself on the realities of the world, I've already done my job. So if I see something, on the bus or what have you, well, I don't really have to be responsible for that. I've already done my job as a citizen. So how do we get people to now be connected to planning their communities or helping be a part of that compassionate team in their day-to-day relationships? How do we get them involved in conversations around journalism or in art? How do we draw them back and understand that that's where the compassion lies? It's not in your social media worlds.
Great comment. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a question. It can just be a comment. There is a question buried in there, and Jeremy wants to take it. And then I see a woman waving in the second row. Jeremy first, and anybody else? Go on. Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is just rejecting out of hand the myths that we're fed in our digital always-on age. So, silence is equated sometimes with complicity. For example, especially in a social media context. So if you're not speaking out about this, you're complicit, or you're conveying something negative, or it's perceived as a negative thing. But there's some truth in that. But on the other hand, you can't be flying off in all directions all the time. And exactly as you say, if you're doing that and you are online and you think, I've done my part because I've posted these things and liked this, and what's the term people use to describe this? Like performative, like performative activism or performative inclusion or whatever you want to call it. Then how do you engage with the real world? So I think it's, even on Twitter, like when you log into the Twitter website, there's an empty box, there's a blinking cursor, and there's the question, what's happening? Who cares? Like, we got to start rejecting some of this stuff to clear some space so that when we encounter real life situations, we can be drawing from something deeper. I don't know. That's my take.
I guess I would add to that, my 14-year-old niece does a great example of that. She uses her Instagram as a platform to do incredible things and inspire people's minds. And I think very often generationally this conversation gets segmented around social media, but if you talk to a millennial about how they use that as a tool for incredible things, that's to me the present and future conversation. I think to answer that point though is to bring it back to yourself. Like, how am I living that as a human today in terms of being, like, making that change? And I guess that why I brought up that show is that I want to be somebody that stands up for bullshit when I see it and not politely divert my eyes because I don't want to offend anybody. So that's where it starts with me. But my social media is also an incredible tool where I can also inspire that. So it's up to you with what you do with that. If you want to like it, if you want to share it, if you want to ignore it, if you want to hate on it, that's cool. But it's still, that is a part of reality in 2018, whether we had, like, it's happening online. People are using that as a platform and a tool to inspire change as well.
In terms of compassion, I think of back in the day, I'll show my age here, when we had block parents. And so there was a sign when you were home that would put up in the window that said, if you need help, you can come here. And I would like to see that translated into safe spaces. I know in some communities, indigenous communities, they had like a green light on the outdoor light at the front, so that people who needed help would know that that was a safe space. Those were things we did very well before we got really big, and I think they're doable again. Very compassionate. I live on a sort of a major street, and a young man crashed his car on an overdose. And I was out there, the police were out there, the healthcare people were out there, the ambulance, and the biggest help was this truck driver who was behind him, who had one of those overdose kits and jumped out too. There were 7 people standing around this overdosing driver to offer him support. We are a compassionate, caring community, and I think safe spaces is another way to do that.
Thank you.
I was just going to make a comment on 2 things, and how do we embrace the dichotomy of embracing people's uniqueness, but that uniqueness itself leads to silos in one regard. So how do we embrace the similarities of our uniquenesses as human beings? Because it's become a world where toxic leads. If it bleeds, it leads. Joy doesn't lead, right? It's those concepts. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say, and yet at the same time, if you bring forward something that is joyful, that is quiet, you also do see that people do respond to it. There is a hunger for it. So for sure, yeah, this is the world we live in, toxic leads, but there's a deeper hunger. So
Quick
I'm just
follow-up?
going to share, sorry, a
Yeah.
CEO of the Homeless Foundation, so I work with people who are homeless every day.
Yes.
I have never once been disrespected downtown by a person who is homeless. I cannot say the same for people on the C train.
A gentleman with the cube, yes.
Thanks. So my name's Gabe Vabro. Full disclosure, I'm friends with Aleem, Bharwani, and I'm also.
All right, you get to talk anyways. Gabe.
Yeah. So this question's not to Aleem. I'm also an internal medicine physician. I spend a lot of my time studying and taking care of the poorest citizens of our city. So I work downtown with the homeless. I work in Forest Lawn. I work with at the refugee clinic, caring for very traumatized refugees that come to this country. And I also work at the Lougheed, and while I believe the tenet of compassion is protective, I also have been, over the last few years, seeing the absolute carnage due to fentanyl or income inequity. And so we, as a city, went through this massive economic boom where huge swaths of our society east of Deerfoot have been left behind. And then us on the front line in the hospitals are left to patch these things up. And so my question to the panel, excluding Aleem, is, how do we, with our economic structures, we can try to make healthy communities and parks and try to make things more accessible, but unless we address the massive economic inequity that leads to all of the poor health and this opioid crisis that we're in the midst of, I just don't understand, and I don't see how people like Aleem or I or others, people in the room, are going to be able to actually get a handle on the carnage that continues.
All right, a couple people want to take that, and anybody else get ready with it? I see a woman in the first row.
That's,
You go first.
yeah, I mean, that's a big question that I don't know the answer to, frankly. But maybe as a starting point to have exactly that conversation, like, are we having that conversation in Calgary? We're not, yeah. And so in each of our fields, wherever we find ourselves, maybe that's it, starting to have that conversation, because it ties into what you're saying, Carrie, like a lot of, our neighborhoods are built for the affluent, right? And so even, Calgary's on a cycling kick lately. We're building a bunch of cycling infrastructure. Most of that goes into affluent neighborhoods. And so how do we start broadening that out? And yeah, I don't know. That's my very humble offering, perhaps.
I think the only thing that kind of that was a really big question that had to make me really reflect. The only thing I can think of is the importance of working together across disciplines. Because we often, I'll use planning, it's such a siloed profession, and we say that we work with all these other disciplines, but we really don't. And when we talk about, for example, like someone above talked about accessibility, I completely agree with you. We build all these places, and we make all these beautiful houses, and they're dense and they'll create vibrancy, but the train or the bus doesn't go there, and so the people that will live there have to by default go by car, but the people that can't, there's only a few people that can actually afford to have a car. And so I think there's a lot to be discussed about working across disciplines and how we can all have very similar goals. Kind of going back to the idea of, I guess, how can we all get involved, and I say this because my colleague is like staring at me, is the value of community associations, and that they are these volunteer groups in your community where their purpose is actually to benefit and build community and build that sense of community. And so their purpose is not to make money. It's to build playgrounds for people, or to have coffee chats so we can all get to know one another, or to bring in public art. That is like the goal of community associations. It's social and recreational, and that's how we can all kind of get involved.
I think Aleem should be able to answer that question too, even though you're saying he shouldn't. I feel
agree.
He should have a shot at it.
I agree, and I want to go back to the room, and I also want to state that nothing would please 6 Degrees more than if somehow we created a connection between different disciplines here. So I want to see a few of you standing around here at the back who haven't worked with the previously. Aleem does get to answer, and then we have a whole couple people over here. Oh, did you want to speak, Colin? Okay. All right, first over to Judith.
I want to go home.
Okay.
So I think compassion also begets compassion. And while it may not be at a 1-to-1 ratio, I think there's a drop-off. if once you start and it starts, because each point of compassion has a ripple effect, and it's once those ripples start colliding with one another, that I think it becomes a multiplier, and that society ends up holistically more compassionate than it once was. But it takes some first movers and some second movers to initiate points of compassion in their community. Again, downhill from whatever you have excess that you can give. You start there, and then it just, I think, multiplies. But I believe it has to be a conscious decision as a community that we individually start acting on that then leads to a higher end product. But it takes time, commitment, and especially for the first, second, third movers.
All right, Cube and then microphone. Is that the right order, Karen? Or you want to? Okay.
Hi. I guess as the city's resident social media shit disturber, I just wanted to weigh in on the discussion of social media, because I think if we leave today saying social media is to blame for lots of what's the negative, I think that's a loss, because to me social media gives everyone a voice, but it's up to us to use that voice. And so I was very active about snow clearing accessibility this winter, and the amount of anonymous emails I got from people, and I never understood anonymous. It made me joke that there was a snow mafia or something like that. People feeding me information, and I wrote every single one of them back that person is capable of using their social media just as much as I am. And so over the last couple of months, I have taken social media off my phone, even though that's how I make a living. And it's caused me to think about using social media more purposefully, and what is the point of what I'm saying. And I think we saw this weekend with the Broncos bus accident, the power of social media, the hockey sticks last night. Social media can be super positive, but it's up to each of us to share those good stories, not just the negative. Thank you.
Can I jump in on that quickly?
Sure.
Mike, we should get in a Twitter fight about this. That would make me very happy. No, just kidding. Absolutely, I think you're totally right. But it's just balancing that. It's a question of balance. For sure, yeah. You look at how Indigenous communities are using, Twitter and social media right now. It's very powerful in terms of unifying people and giving people a voice. But yeah, it can also distort. But we'll fight about this on Twitter afterwards.
Can I just add to that briefly? Just because it was such a huge nugget that you threw out there. But I think one thing I'm constantly faced with recently is checking my own privilege. I think our city could do with some of that checking of privilege. And if we're talking about everyone having a seat at the table, and that's true, and we're authentically saying that everybody does, I mean, even in this room, we paid for tickets. There's a certain level of barriers that maybe don't exist, not speaking on everyone's behalf, but I guess it's my responsibility within my own life and within my own community to see what can I do to nudge at those barriers or push them or shatter them or whatever I can be doing, because even as you're saying that, it's easy for me to distance myself from that if it doesn't impact me directly. But I think there is a way to just, check that and do what I can to connect with people and use whatever minimal skills I have to empower them within their own life and their own community.
Correct order is ma'am, over here, and then the gentleman at the top. Still with.
Yeah, I think I just have a comment, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm full disclosure. I'm Carrie's coworker, so I'm actually just excited to be here, and I love this conversation. But something you said, Aleem, about the compassion, and I actually took a screenshot of your piece around communities being good for your heart. Even everything that you guys were saying and what you brought up here, a comment, is. I really liked your presentation. I really like what you're all saying, because there is a point around accessibility and allowing a seat at a table, but that actually starts by creating opportunities for everybody to understand and build nuggets and see how they can be part of it. So social media is a great opportunity for that. Understanding that actually at the community level, you're helping people feel better, be part of it, and that's why I feel like conversations will happen and have opportunities to be more at the table and start influencing that change we need. I feel I can say a lot of other things, but I really just wanted to comment on that, and I really hope moving forward we do work on working together, but also keeping this relatable and accessible and bringing different stories up by sharing opportunities for all of us to be part of it. Because it doesn't always have to be high level, or even those high level things can have impact from people at the community, whether it is just taking time when a tragic accident happens, or seeing how we can say, well, actually I noticed that my neighbors don't really use that park over there, but it would be great if we could, but there's something happening because I live there and I walk by it all the time and I know we're not using it because of this and this and that. That comment actually reiterated is impactful because we don't know how, or we don't realize that all these little things really matter and create an effect over time, these like micro pieces that really are affecting our health, right? So that's it, and I'll stop talking.
I think the cube, and then the gentleman up above. Where's the cube now? There you are.
Hi. I just wanted to pick up on Carrie's point about working across disciplines. And I actually think, as I was listening to all of you, we can go beyond that. I come to this space as a university educator, and I actually think we can be teaching across disciplines. I think the university system and even the high school system, we're still too confined, I think, within silos in how we teach and educate young people. And so I would love to see more cross-disciplinary teaching. And it strikes me that you're all doing more than your assigned discipline. You're already blurring the lines in your work. Like Aleem, you're doing community development as well as medicine. So I think beyond just working across disciplines, we need to educate in that same vein. So I'd love to hear any thoughts or comments on that.
Let's this gentleman first, and then we can swing back around to that comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for your words. I think I can resonate with what you're saying from an Indigenous perspective, but I think that narrative, that Indigenous narrative, is often missing in these conversations and these spaces. So I'm wondering, the work that I do is mainly focused around mobilizing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I feel like that's a great framework for any sector, any discipline to begin to work towards a resilient community and also incorporate that missing origin story that's often missing from these spaces. But how are you incorporating work of the Truth and Reconciliation into your practice is my question.
Anybody? Aleem first, and then anybody else wants to speak to that. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment. And if we could touch base afterwards, the Cumming School of Medicine, the O'Brien Institute for Public Health, with our Indigenous Health Dialogue team, are hosting a civil society forum in June, where we're going to be exploring and understanding the intergenerational effects of toxic stress and how civil society, Indigenous civil society in particular, can work to interrupt that. So it's an opportunity for us at the Academy to learn what's effective and what's already being done. It's an opportunity for us to also explore and share some of our own data and ideas. And we have some very select policymakers there as well to help enable or amplify some of the ideas that evolve from that. So if we can connect afterwards, I think I would love to have you at that event.
I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because that's something I was thinking about as well. Kind of going back to your comment there when thinking about planning and teaching planning across disciplines. Often within the planning profession, we think, we just deal with the land use and that's it. But we often forget that the decisions we make at the land use stage also affect the social, recreational, environmental, and other areas. And so I think that's a good point for we as planners can check ourselves as well to remember that. But going back to your comment about the Indigenous, so at the Federation, we're actually hosting a conference as well called Beyond the Four Walls on April 28th, where we're working with our community associations to help them understand shifting attitudes. And so we brought in elders to talk about, what does it mean to have the Indigenous in your community and how can we work better together? And we're kind of working across disciplines. So we'll talk about planning, we talk about engagement and inclusion.
I think something I've learned through Studio C is to not try to speak on behalf of any community. And so the different Indigenous groups and students and artists that we've worked with, we've done our best, and it's still been a learning around just sharing any resources or any kind of platform for individuals from that community to express their voices. And obviously it's still an ongoing learning, and there's a ton of work to do there. And then somebody else was bringing up about something around cross-sector collaboration, or you had brought up the comment about people doing something outside of their trained discipline. And I think, from my perspective, you're hitting on something. The new creative director of Louis Vuitton is, everyone's in uproar because he is a street artist and he DJs and he has a t-shirt line. But it's an example of people going across discipline, and that things are moving much more in that direction, where whatever your trained field is, you end up doing so many different roles, and multidisciplinary work is much more of a customized career now than it has ever been. So I think there's room for everybody in this room, regardless of what your sector is that you work in, to branch outside of that, and I think that's how you broaden the impact.
We are down to 5 minutes. So we have time, I think, for 3 further comments, and then a very quick wrap up from our participants. Who has the cube? Raise your cube. There you go, please. Natan, good morning.
Good morning. Excellent conversation. I wanted to talk a bit about compassion and silence, especially in journalism in this country. Also, I want to use the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls file or inquiry as an example. In the beginning, there's a conversation about the challenge, the issue, and there is a widespread compassion for the unforgivably high numbers of Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or have been murdered in this country, which leads to an inquiry, which is another story, which is more of a political story, which then leads to the implementation of the inquiry, which is an even more nuanced political and administrative story. It's very easy for this country's journalists to decide to talk about the failings of an inquiry rather than the compassion towards those who have been lost, who've been murdered, and all of their families and all of their communities who've been affected. So what we come to is instead of empowering solutions, we actually can, through a lack of silence in key areas, create more hurt and more dysfunction and less chance for solving a problem by the very fact that some people weren't silent, or that some people, individuals, were empowered to speak on behalf of a community that they were never empowered to speak on behalf of. And because of a lack of understanding of how Indigenous people's governance works, and a lack of respect from Canada in trying to understand that, we get to a point where it's the bottom of the barrel. This person says this person says that. When in the end, if you go to the hearings, if you hear the voices, that is what we're trying to be compassionate for. That's what we're trying to change. And so sometimes silence is an essential part of social movements and social change. And it's trying to figure out where those silences need to be.
Very quickly, Jeremy, on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
And I think the challenge on the journalist side of that is to step away and to speak to your question and to return to that foundational work, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So instead, I mean, the temptation is always to think you need to report on this latest development, and exactly as you say, you lose perspective at that point, right? And so, yeah, it's being okay with stepping back and okay with uncertainty to a point, and revisiting this work. I think every journalist in Canada should have a printed copy of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. You can order it, it's like $12 on Amazon or something like that. And it's very helpful to return to.
What do you think, Karen? Do we have 2 more? Time for 2 more?
Steph?
Second time, and then I think I will.
Yeah.
Are you okay? We have 2, and then I'm just going to maybe do some thank yous. And I just want to say in advance, I am thrilled with this start to our day. We are throwing down all sorts of extraordinary contentions and questions here. So thank you, everybody.
So again, as a leader, I believe that truth and reconciliation begins by looking internally to yourself. What is my belief system? Challenging my prejudices. I believe I don't have any, and then I realize I do, because of the education system, because of the experience. As a leader in our organization, the Homeless Foundation, we started having face-to-face honest conversations We have Indigenous staff, but it's everyone. When that situation happened in Saskatchewan where the gentleman was acquitted on the murder of a young Aboriginal man, instead of going to Twitter, we gathered everyone in the office, all 40 of us, and we sat down and said, what are we thinking about this? And people shared their perspectives. People were scared to say, well, you know what, maybe I agree with that, maybe I don't. But we started putting that into the open space between us, because when we change our dialogues, we change the world.
Thank you. One more, and then I think we will have to wrap.
I have just been considering everything that's been said today, and I appreciate you all being here. The gentleman that brought up the economy and economics and so on really touched on where I was going, and thoughts around the idea that compassion is free, but protection you can put a price on. And I think that Calgary is full of compassion. I think that the floods demonstrated that. I think the number of people that I hear say they have never benefited from any of the taxes that they pay blows my mind. People don't want to pay for the protection for other people, is my experience. And the NIMBYism that we have here is strong and deep-rooted. And just as this woman before me was saying, we all have our own underlying prejudices that have to be brought forward and exposed. How do we go about bringing more attention to the NIMBYism that is external but also internal? And how do we fight that?
Thank you. Great start today. So much more to come shortly. There will be the first 360 Where We Stand, hosted by John Ross Saul. You had Natan Obed will be participating this afternoon with some other great speakers with the 360 hosted by Adrian Clarkson. We have, I believe, done what we were needed to do, which is to establish a few core preoccupations. I want you all to feel empowered and, in fact, emphatically needing to continue to push out those ideas and those contentions that matter to you throughout the day. For the moment, though, please join me in thanking Jeremy, Colin, Carrie, of course, and Aleem for being such generous speakers this morning.